Hey friends, welcome back to Embrace the Question. Steve here, and we are on our journey through the Bible in this project that we're calling Bible Study with Me. This seems to be gaining momentum. It's been very popular with those who have taken part to this point. If you're new here, welcome. This is not our first episode. We are only in Genesis chapter 7, so you're absolutely getting in on the ground floor of this project, but we are having a good time. There are some phenomenal comments, so I invite you to use that forum to give your thoughts, your opinions, maybe introduce some things that we hadn't thought of, and also to encourage one another. Give somebody else a like on their comment, and that really helps. That helps the community at large. But if you would like more than just this, there are other videos that I produce, obviously. There's also a blog, which I spend time. I try to get at least a post out a week, sometimes more. But the blog is in the notes below here. And that is where people can actually support me in this ministry. Now, the reason that I do that is, one, to pay some bills, but I also have some interests, some loves, if you will, that I try to share that resource with, namely my buddies in Uganda, who are not missionaries. They are stationed there. They are natives, so they're trying to propagate the gospel the best way they can in a place that is a little short on resources, and two, a little short on infrastructure. So they need just about anything and everything that can be provided. So I like to send a portion of that to them as well. But I thank you anyway for joining us. I invite you to just sit back, grab a notebook, grab a highlighter and your Bible, and follow along. Okay, we're in Genesis chapter 7. This one is not, I don't believe, going to be split, so it might be a little bit longer than normal. We'll see how long it takes us to get through it. But let's start with verse 1. And the Lord said unto Noah, Come, thou and all thy house, into the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation. Again, my disclaimer is I'm using the King James because it's the version that has the strong notes in it, the Strong's notes, and we can really easily hover over a section and find out what the Hebrew word is there. I like other translations for my own benefit for when I'm just reading through this, but the King James with the Strong's notes makes it a little easier as we go. So that's the one we're going to use for right now. The Lord's saying, I have seen you righteous before me in this generation. Now remember, the standard of righteousness in that covenant is such a good topic. It's not, he didn't tell Noah, you have to pray a prayer in your heart. You have to invite me in. No, that was not the standard for righteousness. What was it? It was what we find with Abraham, who believed God, and it was accounted unto him as righteousness. Now remember that even Abraham worshiped other gods. He was polytheistic in the beginning. I believe he changed. I believe he realized that, idols are one thing, and then there is God, Jehovah God, that is not just an idol. He talks back to me. He creates an effect around me. So he's the real God, and I believe him when he speaks, and that made Abraham righteous according to God. Noah's in the same boat, pardon the pun. Of every clean beast, get off that thing so it quits flashing up. Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by sevens, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean, by two, the male and his female. as we saw previously, I think just in the last chapter, some translations say 7 pairs. The reason that they're saying that is because it seems to indicate pairs mostly. It refers to the male and the female, right? 7 does not a male and a female make necessarily. So it's either a mistranslation or God he's accounting for a mortality rate. That would make sense too. I mean, it's obvious that we're entering back into a physical system where accidents happen. If there is a mortality rate amongst those that are only 2, well, then that race dies out. But the Lord is ensuring that this race of these species of 7s survive. Now, it could be 7 pairs, and I think we're going to revisit this down in verse 9 again here in just a moment as to why some of the translators chose 7 pairs as opposed to 7s. But the King James is pretty bent on 7s. So verse 3, of fowls also of the air by 7s, the male and the female, to keep the seed alive among the face of all the earth. For yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living substance that I have made will I destroy from off the face of the earth. Okay, 40 days and 40 nights. We're introduced to the number 40 here. We're going to see it often in Scripture. 40, when you ask your standard churchgoer, what does 40 mean? They're going to say, well, that's the number of cleansing. Why? Because that is the number that's always associated with getting something out of the system. Israel was doomed to walk the desert for 40 years. Why? Because a generation, an unbelieving generation, was condemned to fall in the desert, and they were not to inherit the promise because of their disbelief. So God used 40 years to get something out of the system, a disbelief in the generation. In this case, 40 days and 40 nights, and he's going to remove the living substance that he's made and destroy it from the face of the earth. Seems pretty harsh, doesn't it? We're going to talk about that again as we go. And Noah did according unto all the Lord had commanded him. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters was upon the earth. Don't you ever wonder, I'm half a century old. Not exactly, but maybe a little more. I'm not really saying, but it doesn't seem like half a century. It seems like I'm still a kid. I still like my games and still like to act like a kid, and I just happen to have a wife and kids, And my dad says he feels the same way. I wonder what Noah felt like. Life is so fleeting. I wonder what 600 years felt like. Did it feel like a short time? I can't imagine that 100 years of building a boat under serious ridicule would move very quickly. I would imagine that was a slow century for him. But that is one of the questions I have for these patriarchs when I see them. 600 years. Verse 7, and Noah went in, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him into the ark because of the waters of the flood, of clean beasts and of beasts that are not clean, and of fowls, and of everything that creeps upon the earth. There went in 2 and 2 unto Noah into the ark. It sounds like Noah had very little to do with the wrangling. They went in to him. Into the ark, the male and the female, as God had commanded Noah. All right. So it is easy to see why certain translations say, well, they just meant 7 pairs because everything is male and female. They could be right. They could be right. I don't know. All right, verse 10. And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were upon the earth. So it's been raining 7 days, and now things are getting serious. We're starting to see streams overflow their banks. You get the picture. We see that today. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month of the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. Why were the fountains of the great deep broken up? I find that interesting. Not just rain. We're not just talking about rain. We're talking about all the geysers, all the springs, everything decided to cooperate in this event. That's why a lot of scientists, creation scientists mostly, but scientists in general, think that this event had some extraterrestrial help. And I'm not talking about aliens. I'm talking about things that changed gravity, like the passing by of a large celestial body that changed gravity to the point where water was pulled. Everything changed for just a season. Not necessarily something that Noah would have noticed. And it's conjecture. I don't mind the conversation. I think it's somewhat interesting to contemplate. But all the springs and the fountains of the deep were broken up. Okay? And the rain was upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. So the earth is being cleansed. This is our inaugural introduction to 40 days and 40 nights. In the selfsame day entered Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them, into the ark. Okay, it's worth pointing out, we've talked about this a bit, perhaps more than destruction, we're talking about the recreation. We're talking about all things new. We're talking about a new creation, a new creature. What's the number of new beginnings? 8. How many are in the ark? 8. It's interesting to me also that one of the things that we've spent a lot of time on is, where did the ark land? And Ararat will be mentioned here as we go, not in this chapter, but the mountains of Ararat. I know that people say they have found the ark. I know that people think they know where the ark was. One of the provoking places to me is in Iraq, in a place called the Valley of Eight. And it is a place that's protected by the Iraqi government. I don't know that you could go visit it if you want to. I don't know that you would want to. But it is a beautiful valley. It is way off in the mountains. And there is definitely an outline of a boat from what I can recall. Is that really it? I don't know. It's amazing how God hides things and leaves them to faith, is it not? So let's go to verse 14. They and every beast after his kind, and all the cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth after his kind, and every fowl that is after his kind, and every bird after every sort. Now, I love that. I love that it's not every bird after its kind. That's led me to click on this word here, sort. And it's the word kanaf. Now, I know that some of you are familiar with this word. Others of you are not, and I will explain this. It's basically, well, it says it's a flap. But ultimately, it's this guy right here. It's wing. So a bird after every sort, every wing. Why is that cool? Well, because there's this thing here called a talit. It is a prayer shawl This one I've had for many years. And the tallit is worn. If you've watched the Chosen videos, then you know. You get to see how they're worn, but they're worn around the shoulders like that. And when the rabbis walk, these fill with air. If they don't have an outer garment over the top, these fill with air, like a wing. So this is the kanaf. This right here is the kanaf. These are tzitzi. This is a kanaf, and this thing is called a tallit. So there's your Hebrew lesson. And that gets really cool as we go. We'll talk about that again at some point. So, creatures, fowl after its kind, every bird of every wing. And they went into Noah, into the ark, 2 and 2, of all flesh, wherein is the breath of life. If they weren't breathing, then they didn't go in. And they that went in, male and female, of all flesh, as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. Who shut him in? The Lord shut the door. That is an important distinction. A lot of sermons have been made off of Genesis 7:16. When it comes time for the door to shut, it's always God that shuts it ultimately. The study of the last days, or eschatological studies, is where we really get into the meaning of this verse and the meaning of this story, because if you believe that at some point those that are believers go to be with God and those that are not will not, much like we see happening in this story, then this provides us some resolution to what that could look like, because ultimately those who are gods will rise up above the chaos, as in the ark, and those that want in can't get in because God has shut the door. That is a picture that has been used for a long time. So keep that in mind as we go. In verse 17, and the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, and it was lifted up above the earth. How did Jesus walk on the water? He walked above the chaos. The righteous always hovers above. Genesis 1:2. The Spirit of God hovered above the waters. Okay. And the waters prevailed. They finally covered everything and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. Now we're using the same terminology that we saw back in Genesis 1. This is a Bible study. Let's take a look at it. The Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So what we have going on here, guys, is definitely a rewriting of Genesis 1. He's determined that there is a lot of tohu and bohu, without form and void. Tohu and bohu on the earth, and he doesn't like it, so he's going to change it. All right, so that is interesting because we have a rewriting of something, a recreation of something. At this point, our new Adam is Noah, from which everybody has descended from Noah. Every one of us has descended from Noah. That's crazy. Much like every one of us has descended from Adam. All right, that was 17, I believe. Right? And it was lifted up above the earth. No, that was 18. And the ark went upon the face of the waters, and the water prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered, all the high hills. Notice it doesn't say, well, it does say mountains coming down here. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains, the Har, were covered. 15 cubits, that's a cubit, between the wrist and the elbow. So our standard for the cubit is 18 inches. When you're talking about 15 of those, you're talking about approximately 23 feet, a little bit less. 23 feet above the highest mountains that there were. Now, remember that we're not talking about Mount Everest here. Mount Everest was not yet. The earth had not formed its mountain ranges yet, not to the point that they are now, because the crust hadn't caved in due to the weight of the water. When you have a sphere like the earth, you note that the crust is thinner in certain places and thicker in other places. So if you cover it with something heavy like water, then eventually the water is going to push in on the thin places and it's going to pry up when it does. Now we're talking about the formation of oceans and mountain ranges. That's where we get into Peleg. I always think peg leg, but it's Peleg, who is coming up, I think, in Genesis 15 or 16. In his days, the world was divided. Why? Because the waters are settling, the mountains are rising, and natural boundaries are forming. All right? Verse 21. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both fowl, and of cattle, and of beasts, and of every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that in the dry land died. So also keep in mind when you're reading, I don't know how your translation looks, but anything that is italicized or grayed out like that, it's not in the original text. We add that for the ability to understand as we go. Sometimes that stuff is right and sometimes it is not really correct. So just be wary of that. In verse 23, and every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle and creeping things and fowls of the heavens, and they were destroyed from the earth, and Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. 150 days. That is an interesting number. We have, again, when you take the zeros off, you have the number 15. That's the root of the number, if you will. So that's the one that I would look at first. What does 15 mean? To which I can't really tell you. I am not a numerology expert. 15 is a 3 and a 5. 3 times 5, right? So there is the perfection of 3, and there is 5, which is the number of grace and the number of law both. And then you can multiply that by 10, which is another number by law, and you get the 150. So there's a lot of things you can go with the 150, but I think that 150 days is absolutely relevant. I don't think it's arbitrary. I mean, the waters prevailed for 150 days. Why not 151 or 149? So let's just keep 150 in mind as we move forward. We may come back to this and compare at some point. But we made it all the way through Genesis chapter 7. I think that's a pretty fascinating chapter. I hope you're enjoying it. What did I miss? What would you have brought out? Every time I go back and reread it, I think, well, I should have really mentioned that. And it's funny that Holy Spirit just doesn't bring out everything on the first pass. So maybe he did to you, and maybe that's why he shields it from me so that you guys will speak up in the comments. So I hope you'll do that. I look forward to the next chapter. We'll get that out in the next day or two. But until then, I bless you all and peace.